When we talk about standardized tests in almost any school, they will have one or the other, but not both, of criterion referenced and norm referenced tests. Now, recognizing that this may be quite a bit of review for many of the many of you as leaders, um, we still wanted to include this in the presentation to be reflective about and recognize the fact that different standardized tests are designed for different purposes. The Terra Nova, the Iowa assessments, the SAT, the PSAT are norm reference tests. They're primarily for ranking students relative to their peers. They contain tests or questions that are perhaps not yet learned. Um, the testing approach is sometimes unfamiliar, in particular in the kinds of questions that are asked and that sort of thing. For those reasons, they may not be as relevant for data-driven instruction as criterion reference tests, which assess proficiency and mastery of standards. And if there's a good link between the standards that the assessment, the criterion reference test assesses, and the curriculum it's being taught, then they can be very useful tools for data-driven instruction. The PARCC, Smarter Balanced, state tests tend to be criterion referenced. More and more tests are trying to be both. So the NWEA MAP tests, the STAR assessments, tend to kind of walk the line and balance. Although, if your school is using norm reference tests like the Terra Nova or the Iowa, even the PSAT, you can get criteria. You can sort of look at them in a criterion referenced way. Regardless of the kind of test that you're looking at, you'll probably see one or more of these types of scores articulated on the test or on the results of the test. And again, these are things that are probably quite familiar to all of you, um, but they do appear in the assignment, so we wanted to give them at least a little bit of treatment here. Normative scores are largely percentile rank. Grade equivalents can be used in this way, and they basically say where does a student or a group of students rank in comparison to other students or other groups. A second way the second type of score is proficiency scores or mastery scores. You'll often see these as cut scores: proficient, advanced, basic, that kind of language. And they're based on usually a certain percentage of content demonstrated as having been mastered. And then there are growth scores, and different tests identify growth in different ways, and it's important to be able to look at growth scores. And standardized tests are looking at growth scores and communicating them in more and more sophisticated ways. Um, the scale score, which is accessible to in the electronic versions of the data analysis tools that administrators and teachers have access to, are often very helpful in establishing all three types of scores, and particularly the growth score. So in your schools, you may be sort of looking at any one of the following types of tests. Again, there are others. There are more. Some are taking the PARCC. Some are taking Terra Nova tests. Some are taking the NWEA MAP test. Some are taking multiple tests. So we've just chosen a couple here to kind of give a sense of what the normative data are scores, and the proficiency scores and the growth scores are. So if you kind of look across the top there, the norm-based scores or the norm reference scores are usually percentile ranks. The STAR has something called a growth percentile, which is also sort of how a student's growth ranks against other students who started at the same place. The Iowa assessment has a percentile rank, and the PSAT doesn't have a normative score per se, but you can compare to state scores, national scores, local scores. If you're a high school looking at other high schools in the area, gives you a proxy for a normative score. Proficiency and mastery, again, in the STAR, there's the domain and skill set scores. There's the reading level score. And the Iowa assessment does not have a proficiency or mastery per se built into the analysis, but There may be in your local diocese, and if not, the Iowa State has proficiency levels associated with the certain scale scores. So in this case of the Iowa assessments, you have to do a little more digging to get at proficiency and mastery than you would with, say, the STAR assessments or the NWEA MAP assessments. And then the PSAT has the college readiness scores, or predicted SAT scores, which are related to college readiness scores. And so here you have, again, perhaps a couple of steps to go to get at a sense of proficiency and mastery. But the pieces are there to be manipulated to find those. And then again, looking at growth, in all three cases, the scale score is present. Sometimes it's more accessible than others. You have to do a little more digging in the analysis tools, but that's part of the purpose of this assignment, is to kind of unpack standardized assessment scores a little bit more than we normally do and look at the different kinds of scores that are available. In the case of the PSAT score that you're given or a student is given is in fact the scale score. So it's fairly straightforward in interpreting what is the major score there. So again, this doesn't cover all of the different standardized tests that may be in place across your schools, but it gives a sense of some of the keywords that you might look for. I would also say that every one of these standardized tests has very good guides for interpreting scores, and they're very easily accessible either within your school or a simple Google search for those guides to interpretation. And that may be a good resource for you as you complete this assignment. So looking at the assessment analysis assignment, we're going to ask that first you choose a standardized assessment to analyze. Sometimes in a pre-K to 8 or K to 8 school, there's only one choice, and so that's the one you use. If you are in high school, the PSAT is going to be easier to manipulate and will likely be more informative than SAT scores. If you have PSAT scores, if you have neither of those and you have a non-college board assessment, that may be a better assessment for the purposes of this analysis. If your school has none of these things, then be in touch with your instructor and we'll work something out with you. We do have some sample data, for example, that could be used. Then you'll choose one grade. So let's say you choose 5th grade, and you need to be able to have scores available for that grade for 3 years. In other words, the last 3 5th grades, and then scores available for those students for 3 years. So their 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade scores to be able to look at those. If you're in high school, a high school teacher, a high school leader, and you're using PSAT scores, you may only have PSAT scores for 2 years. You may have another college board administered assessment like the PSAT 8-9, as it used to be called, or the Ready Step. You may not have those. So that, again, that longitudinal data may be a little different in high school. And if you have trouble finding a good example of longitudinal data, please let us know. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you can secure and ensure access to the scores. And so for the kinds of analyses that you'll need to do, in almost every case, you'll need more than the paper reports. So you'll need access to whatever digital reports are available and the analysis tools that are available to administrators in your school. If that kind of access becomes a problem in your situation, also let us know. It's possible that if you are a teacher of one grade, you may be able to do this completely with the scores available to you as a teacher of that one grade. However, it's more useful if you have access to the school's scores. And so if that becomes a concern, please let us know. So once you have your sort of your access and your scores, the test that you'll be looking at, you're going to select the key areas for analysis. That can be broad, the total reading score, or specific, the comprehension score, whatever makes most sense in your context. And that should be based on the priorities of the school, the specific scores that you're looking at. In the case of the PSAT, the options are limited. In other standardized tests, the options are limited too. So it may be useful to talk with other administrators at the school, perhaps your principal, if you are not the principal, and think about what are the key scores that we should be looking at. And then we'll expect in the assignment, there are specific prompts about sort of giving a little bit of context about what happens at your school, and reporting on some of the normative and proficiency and growth scores that you have at your disposal. Again, they may take a little bit of digging to do. They may take um, they some of them may not be the most reported score for the particular test that you have, but in almost every case, all of those scores are available if you are able to look at um, the digital interface for analyzing scores. If you're able to access that, those scores are available. And then finally, we'll ask that you follow the analysis prompts, which ask you to sort of take a little bit deeper dive, so to speak, into the numbers that you've uncovered. And then finally, just to kind of summarize here about this assignment, again, it's really to think about standardized assessments in new ways. In many cases, you'll be looking at scores either for different grades or different types of scores than you're used to looking at, and that kind of broad perspective can open eyes about the kinds of things that standardized assessments can tell. Getting a little bit hands-on with data if you haven't done that before, and then ultimately connecting to student learning and the next steps you'd have to take as a principal to benefit from what you learn. To reiterate what we said earlier, standardized assessments are not usually the best assessments for data-driven instruction and really authentically using curriculum-tied assessments for assessing student learning and addressing the needs of students as a result of what the assessments say. However, they do have a place in providing some of that information, and even more so in triggering questions that require follow-up with teachers to validate or question what the standardized assessment scores say relative to what the teacher knows about the students, relative to what the teacher's experiences are, and so forth. Again, if you have any questions or run into any problems or concerns, please be in touch with your instructor.